At Envision, we track a lot of what the users do at a high level, meaning we track the interactions that a user performs. And we do this so that we can identify popular workflows within the application, as well as usability issues, things that people are not using, things that people are finding hard to use. And then we can use that data to make future decisions about where we want to invest our effort. And tracking an interaction within the application typically looks something like this. We have an analytics library that has a track method. We pass in something like a user ID, the action or the event type that is being performed, and then some set of attributes of that action, typically some sort of an action property, and then some other additional information perhaps about the user itself, such as their role within the particular enterprise and whether or not this is even an enterprise. I guess this should really be true. And you can imagine that adding this code, even at, 9 lines of code, adding this at the points of interaction can create a lot of noise within your application, making the code a lot harder to read, because essentially all of this code is diluting the actual meaning of the code that you're working on. So over time, what I've discovered is a pattern in which I can take the one piece of information that really meaningfully changes about this entire event, and I abstract that out into some sort of a variable, and then I can wrap this inside of a function, track user interaction, and I can do something like this, where I am locking the analytics code down to everything that can remain fairly static within a component. So this will be a component level abstraction. Then I pass in the one thing that actually changes to identify the interaction. And now I have this simple function abstraction local to my component that I can call with a simple API to track users with minimal amount of noise. So let's see this in action. Let's look at our browser here. So here's a list of friends, and you can click on friends to view details, and there's a couple of actions. And so let's just refresh. We can see that when we refresh, we get an action equals open here. If I click into a friend, we get our view friend event. I can edit, I can delete. You can see that we're tracking this robust event object with a differentiation in this action property. All right, so now that we see how this works, let's take a look at the code to see how we keep this to a minimum level of noise within our component. So here is my demo. I'm using AngularJS. The version of Angular, whether or not it's even Angular, doesn't really matter. The same kind of pattern would, I think, be used in any type of application. So here's a view. We'll come back to our view in a second. But here is our controller for the view. You can see we're injecting with an inversion of control, our analytics library that has that track function. And I have my public methods and I have private methods. And what you will see is that I have a public method, track user interaction, just as we saw before. I'm passing in the one piece of event differentiation here, the actual action that's being performed by the user. And this is a component level abstraction. So it's not like I'm creating a track user interaction abstraction to be used across the entire app. We already have the analytics.track function to do that. What I'm now doing is creating an abstraction at the component level to keep as much of the event static as possible, and creating, again, this simple API that I can call, which you'll see when the component loads, we're calling track user interaction open. And then when I click on various buttons, say edit and delete, you can see at the top of these functions, I have, again, the call to track user interaction, passing in just the differentiating property on that event object, track user interaction, edit, delete. Now, because this is being exposed as a public function, it means I can also access this within a view. So if we scroll up here, you can see that when I click on the friend to view a friend, we have our href here. And in addition to the href, I also have a click handler, and I'm using the click handler to track the user interaction as well. Now, I really, really enjoy having both the href and the click handler on the same element here, because without that, typically what we would have is a click event that handles the user interaction and then forwards the current user to this href. And that becomes really problematic from an accessibility standpoint. When I mean accessibility, I mean like the actual browser behavior, meaning we want to have hrefs as often as possible when changing location so that the user has options to, say, command click and open that in a new window. If we just have click handlers, we lose a lot of that native accessibility in the browser. So adding tracking and analytics, it's just a part of life. Like, you need to do that in order to make data-driven decisions about how people are using the application so that you can make better products going forward. But again, adding analytics really dilutes the overall intent of the code that you're looking at. And I'm finding that by creating a component local function abstraction and passing in just the part of the event that changes, you can see that I really can keep that noise down to a minimum while still not sacrificing the robustness of the data that I'm actually tracking. And the nice thing about having this tiny abstraction is that it forces me to remove just arbitrary data that I might want to track because I might need it someday. I'm really a huge fan of tracking only the data that you need and not arbitrary properties that may or may not be used and can end up just adding code rot over the long term of an application lifecycle. So this is what I do on the client side. This is also the same exact pattern that I use on the server side. If this were a Cold Fusion component on the server, I would have the same sort of thing where I have a analytics tracking function, private function, typically to a Cold Fusion component because it has no view to speak of. And I would pass in just the parts that change and abstract away the static complexity of the actual event object. So this is how I've minimized the necessary evil of tracking, and be curious to know if anyone has even better suggestions that might make this even less of an intrusive part of application development.